Hello, friends. It's great to be back with you again on our channel. I want to thank you for all the wonderful people I've met. I've been on the road an awful lot this summer, and it's been a pleasure to hear from you. Your prayers, your support for AMI365.org has been a colossal encouragement to me. The message that we're going to put up today is by Ron Duffield. It seems like we're repeating the history of the Hillsburg church in the mid-1880s. George Santayana, writing in his book, The Life of Reason in 1905, said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeating it." I'm concerned that this story from the early part of our church history has been repeated recently here in Michigan. It's my prayer that as you examine it, you'll pray over it, that you'll let God move on your heart about what should be done about it. Let's be praying for our leaders. Let's be praying that we have the right spirit, but let's not repeat the history of the early days. Be sure to watch it all, especially the last 30 minutes, and may God bless us as we seek to do better. Remember, writing in the book to the Hebrews, Paul told us that all these things were written down for our admonition. And also, let's remember what Ellen White said, we have nothing to fear for the future except we forget our teachings and the way the Lord has led us in the past. Yeah. I look forward to sharing with you many more messages in the future, and God bless you as you continue seeking the Lord and anticipating His soon return.
I want to start out with a few kind of announcements, and then I'll have prayer, and then we'll get into the presentation for this afternoon. Now, yesterday when I was talking about the NRA and the movement, the two extremes, left and right, fighting and building up into a crescendo, which led to the Sunday laws in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and culminated, by the way, in 1888 when the National Sunday Law went before a congressional committee. I mentioned the book by Uriah Smith called Marvel of Nations, and it's in the process. I misspoke. It's actually not published yet, but it will be published by Adventist Pioneer Library, which you can see there on the left, and it will also be available on Ellen White Audio. Both these websites are run by the same organization. This is the group years ago that worked with the White Estate to put the Adventist Pioneer writings on the CD-ROM. And of course now that's all online, but they've published many books, and especially in the last few years, they've really increased the volume or the number of books that they're reproducing. So Uriah Smith's Marvel of Nation is one of those. Charles Snow, 1914, they're republishing that book as well on America, the history of America. Another book they just got done with, a new cover even, is The Right of the People by A.T. Jones. And actually there's going to be a couple boxes of these books here to be given out to those who want a copy. And this, I'm reading through it right now, and this is loaded with, I think, pertinent information for us today. A.T. Jones. I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow afternoon. I also want to point out that there is audiobooks of all of these books, or most of them as well, on both of these websites. So if you enjoy listening to a book rather than reading it, you can also do that. And then there's also, even my two books are on there in audio, and then you can download it as a PDF or order copies of that from these particular websites. So I just wanted to pass it along because some have asked about this. Now, before I have prayer, I just want to mention a little bit about this presentation. I've never presented this presentation before. And I've actually spent about the last 6 months, not solid time, but going through material on this particular presentation. And as you can tell, this is most of this collection of material I got on this particular presentation, trying to take all of this and put it into a few slides in an hour's presentation has been one of the most painful experiences of my life. And there's so much intricacy and details in this presentation. I even made kind of a calendar of the 5-month period or so that it took place you don't need to see all the details, but I tried to. There's so many details and different letters going back and forth, and meetings and so forth that I had to actually try to, get a visual in my mind so I could keep everything straight. So all of that is to say, I am feeling quite challenged as I stand here today to present on this, I believe, a very important topic. And so with that in mind, I would like to pray that the Lord will give me clarity to say the right things in the right way, not get buried in too many details that will lose you, but that will carry you along in this story from our dusty past, so that we can learn important things for today. So if you wouldn't mind, would you kneel with me as we pray as we begin this meeting? Father, I thank you for this opportunity to be talking about liberty of conscience. And Lord, we come to you today as sinful human beings, all suffering from that Adamic human nature. And we're so thankful, Lord, that Jesus has come in that nature and overcome and can help us and deliver us as individuals, and also help us as a church, Lord, today as we face so many challenges. Lord, I pray that you will be here through your Holy Spirit to guide our thoughts, to guide my words in what is presented this afternoon, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, when I was a young boy, my mom used to listen to the radio, and every noon hour or thereabouts, she would turn on a news channel and listen to a particular broadcaster who would talk about the relevant things in the news of that day. And then he would also, there was also other segments of his program where he would talk about history of, some pretty famous individuals, and he would give details that you've never heard of before. And then towards the end of that presentation, he would inform you with the closing line, and now you know the rest of the story. And of course, that was Paul Harvey, and he had a program that ran for many years with, a lot of interesting facts about individuals you would never think of or knew about until you heard that story. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon and tomorrow kind of falls into that category. The rest of the story, stories from our Adventist history that we may not have heard of, but I feel are relevant. But before I get into that story, I want to set a little bit of a context, and that was what I talked about last night. For 40 years, Adventists have been preaching about Revelation prophecies, chapter 13 and 14. And by 1882, based on the NRA's work, it wasn't just that Sunday laws were coming, they were in action. 38 states, several territories, I don't know how many, almost every one of them had active Sunday laws in place. People were being arrested. This was one slide I showed. Even in California, 82, 1,600 people had been arrested for violating Sunday laws. So this wasn't even just talk about it or possibly coming or soon. It was actually being enacted across this country. So there was no question in any Seventh-day Adventist who was awake that we were living in the very times that were that talked about in Bible prophecies, and which Adventists have been talking about for 40 years. And the story that I want to talk about took place in Hillsburg, California in 1885. This is the northern part of California, in a valley there, north of Sacramento. And just to give you a little settings, a little bit of history about Northern California there, Loughborough and Bordeaux had come to California in the 1860s and started the work there, and they had raised up a church in Hillsburg, the first church I understand of in California. 1869, they actually built a church because they had several members. But by 1871, they actually had outgrown that church. And so they built another one. I don't have any better picture. This is just a sketch, obviously. And this was the Hillsburg Church in 1871, which was still, they were still using in 1885. Now, here's kind of a better maybe idea of what that house of worship looked like. It was like a big home converted into a church with a porch all the way around. They called it the Beehive. In 1881, James White had passed away, and Ellen White moved to Oakland, where her son, W.C. White, lived. And in 1882, she bought a home there in Hillsburg. And this was about 30 miles north of St. Helena, where the sanitarium was. It was started in 1878 under the Rural Health Retreat name, and later it was changed to St. Helena Sanitarium. So that was all in this valley area there of Northern California. You also had the Hillsburg Academy, first school, Adventist school on the West Coast. Started out 1882 as an academy. That same year, they changed the name to college, Hillsburg College. And it grew very rapidly. And by 1883, they built this large dormitory, and I think there was a cafeteria in the basement there. And by 1885, there was around 225 students that were attending school there. So you get the idea that this was a growing Adventist community there, especially as more and more people came into the faith through their evangelism. And south of there, of course, was Oakland, and this is the area where Pacific Press was located, kind of the heart of the work in California. In 1885, on the left there, that was the first Pacific Press building. The other two large building in the center, Pacific Press, and the church on the right, those were built in 87. But in 1885, the Pacific Press, the smaller one, was there, and that's where they published all their books and magazines. And this is kind of two of the main magazines they published, the Signs of the Times and American Sentinel. Now, interestingly enough, the American Sentinel, I found out here recently, was actually voted at the 1884 General Conference to transfer the Sabbath Sentinel to the Pacific Press so that they could, have a religious liberty magazine. It would be the name would be changed to American Sentinel. And actually, the summer of 1885, they had articles already written for it, and they were going to begin to publish it. But because everybody was so busy with different things, they waited until January of 1886. But the whole idea of this Liberty magazine, American Sentinel, had started, a couple of years before, and it was specifically for the purpose. If you read there, every month it came, the reason for the magazine was to defend civil and religious liberty, and to be an answer to the National Reform Association that was obviously gaining so much traction in the United States, and for which all these Sunday laws had been enacted. Now, C.H. Jones was the manager of the Pacific Press. He also sat on many committees there. J.H. Wagner, first-generation Adventist, was the lead editor of both these magazines. And then, of course, Jones and Wagner were assistant editors of both of these magazines. So this is just to kind of give you an idea of the setting in California that this story takes place. Now, there was that as far as I understand, I can't find any evidence that there was a conference building. But the conference, the president and the executive committee pretty much all resided there in the Oakland area. And S.N. Haskell was the president of the California Conference. And then the executive committee, the rest of the executive committee was made up of Loughborough, J.H. Wagner, William Ing, and E.J. Wagner. Now, S.N. Haskell was out of the country at the time in 1885. And so A.T. Jones, although he was not on the executive committee, he did play a big part in, some of the conference issues at this time, and particularly in this story that I'm sharing this afternoon. Now, in 1885, there's something else that you should know, and that is that, California was still part of the Wild West. And so, as many converts came into the Adventist church, there is perhaps some of that Wild West characteristic that still hadn't been overcome in, church members' lives. And There was sometimes conflicts and some interesting views and theologically and otherwise that would come to a head. And so that kind of gives you an idea as well. This is California, 1885. Ellen White, in that year, 1885, she was getting ready to leave for Europe for 2 years, leave in July, end of July, early August. I think August 7th, she left. And but before she went, she had preached several sermons to this Hillsburg church. It was the fastest growing church, in the conference because the college was there, and it was an important church. And yet she saw that it had some defects, and so she preached, and really laid it out there that there needed to be more practical Christianity and more witnessing. And more humility and, some of these things. Arthur White, kind of summarizing this, says, in the summer of 1885, being deeply concerned for the welfare of the church, she made earnest appeals calling the members to a deeper religious experience. But the response was less than what she had expected and hoped and prayed for. She earnestly longed for the church at Hillsburg to triumph and set an example as a church. So here's a church, important church that, did have some issues. And Ellen White, when she packed her bags and left for 2 years from Hillsburg, she kind of just turned that case over to God. Even with her best efforts, it seems there hadn't been a change. Now, one of the issues that had, come up was that Ellen White was trying to convince the church they were outgrown their beehive church, and they needed to build a new church there in Hillsburg that could seat all the people that, were part of the church at that time and those that would come in as well. And so this is just a drawing of what that church might look like. And there was also, the idea was not only would they build this church to be able to seat all the members and more coming in, but they also, there was thoughts that they should build a large attachment to it where it would have classrooms and which could be used for college classes, but also, church, like Sabbath school classes perhaps, but also as a mode of outreach to the community for classes that could be taught in this church. But this was really only a dream because Ellen White could never get the church to really get behind this. Nobody felt like it was really possible, the cost and just the enormity of such a big task. And so that had never really, gone through. Well, another individual I need to tell you about that's part of this story is Emergene Philander Daniels, better known as E.P. Daniels. Easier to say that name anyways, rapidly. And he had been not been an Adventist until he was about 30 years old, 1875. He became a Seventh-day Adventist. He had served 3 years as a pastor, actually, in Michigan, before coming to California. So he'd been about a Seventh-day Adventist for about 10 years and a pastor now. And he moved to California specifically because W.C. White and Ellen White had asked him to come from Michigan to help record her sermons. He was very good at shorthand, and so he would record Ellen White's sermons when she was at camp meetings, and then that would be available to put in the Adventist church's magazines and so forth. But W.C. White also wanted him to come because he was, I guess, good on a typewriter. And also taking notes, transcriptions from W.C. White, so E.P. Daniels could do a lot of his correspondence, W.C. White being very busy with at the heart of the work there in Oakland. So he taught shorthand and also voice and Bible instructions at the college, but there was one problem. E.P. Daniels, when he came from Michigan, was in debt. And evidently, while he was in Michigan, he was only making about $3.50 a week, which seems a little low compared to the other salaries that I've heard of in that time. But for whatever reason, he had a family of 3 children and a wife, and he had fallen into debt. And so when he came to California, even though he would have been able to spend more time in evangelism and preaching, he had gotten into debt, and so he started teaching classes in a secular setting in Oakland to help pay down his debt. And on the weekends, he would travel to Hillsburg, where his family lived and where really he was from, there, being Ellen White and being there before she left for Europe. And so he left Oakland on one Friday afternoon to go back to Hillsburg, and the head elder, Mr. Granger, who was also the principal of the college, asked E.P. Daniels to preach for him, which he would often do. When E.P. Daniels was there on the weekend, he would take charge of the sermons and preach at the Hillsburg church. And so E.P. Daniels did that, and notice this is what Mrs. Granger said. She says, Elder Daniels came up on Friday to stay over with his family till Monday. Mr. Granger always asked him to preach, and every time he preached, the interest increased. And soon, such an interest was manifest that it was thought best to continue the work through the week. So you get the idea. He preached on a Friday, I think he did a Friday night presentation, and then they asked him to preach Sabbath, and then, well, why not Sunday night? And there was such an interest that Mr. Granger said, could you stay? Could you come back go to Oakland and tie up your work there and come back and continues this series of meetings? There seemed to be a great interest, even a revival there at the church. And so E.P. Daniels went down to Oakland and hired someone else to take over his classes in shorthand, and he came back to Hillsburg, and they started holding nightly meetings at the Hillsburg church, and that turned into 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, all the way to 5 weeks. They held nightly meetings at the Hillsburg church, and there seemed to be a great interest and a revival that was sparked there in the Hillsburg church. However, there was some problems that developed, and you see this in C.H. Jones, a letter from him. He says, we began to hear reports from Hillsburg that made us feel somewhat alarmed. You know Brother Daniels and know that he is an enthusiast and not very well balanced. So back kind of down at the heart of the work, word kind of trickled down there during these 5 weeks that all was not well during these revivals at the Hillsburg church. And so some of that information came from church members. The majority of church members obviously were very appreciative of this revival that had come to their church, but there were some that were more than concerned. And so when they stopped by in Oakland for whatever reason, they would share with the various leaders there their concerns of this revival meeting. And one of those concerns, I'm just going to touch on a few of these concerns. And, there's a lot of details I don't have time to share in each one, but I just want to kind of give you an idea. Now, one of the issues that came up was over Sabbath school offerings. And the head elder, Mr. Granger, had a concern that there was a lot of fundraising and activities during the whole activity of the offering collection and so forth, that he felt like made it more like the temple in Jesus' time, where it became a den of thieves and so forth. And when obviously E.P. Daniels was there and they must have talked about this issue, they came to the conclusion that, we really should stop taking up offerings on Sabbath school time, because it seems to had taken on, the people aren't prepared for it, and there's fundraising going on, and maybe this shouldn't be done. And so they stopped taking up Sabbath school contributions during this revival series there in Hillsburg. And of course, that concerned them. So Brother Daniels in his preaching has struck right against some of the very important points of our doctrine. For instance, he has denounced Sabbath school contributions and claims that it is a violation of Sabbath. So that was concern to the conference folks down in Oakland. Another issue that came up was in regard to some of the meetings there. Now, Eunice Kelsey, she was the mother of Mary Kelsey, who married W.C. White, and so Mary Kelsey was in Europe with W.C. White. And so Eunice is writing to her daughter, and she describes this next kind of area of concern that some people had, and that was, she says, yesterday Sabbath was a good day. Many came forward and there was weeping in the congregation. There was a division made. Those who came forward were requested to go below, and some of the leading brethren who had got into the light were requested to go with him. So you kind of get the idea. There was, an altar call. People came forward confessing and, I guess being a sense of a reconversion experience. And so there was somewhat of a division, and they went to meet with those others who were considered in this group. And so the concern was that this was somewhat of a Pharisaical mindset beginning to set into this revival, and that people were a little better than others. And so this was a concern that made its way down to Oakland. Another issue that came up was in regard to E.P. Daniels' debt. And in one of his meetings, there was he had mentioned the fact that the reason he wasn't there all the time in Hillsburg was because he had debt. And the concern came that now he was diverting money from the conference to go into his own pocket by allowing the church to pay off his debt. So this is, again, says one thing of the conference objected to, and that was that the Hillsburg church had done wrong in lifting Elder Daniels' debt load. And lastly, at the end of the 5 weeks of time, the meetings seemed to be going so well to the Hillsburg church there that they thought, the camp meeting's coming up down in Fresno, and for all of us to pack up and go down there, we're going to miss out on these important meetings. Maybe we should stay here. And so this is how C.H. Jones describes this particular issue. He says, then another brought word from Hillsburg that Brother Daniels was advising the brethren not to go to the camp meeting, and many said that they were having better meetings there in Hillsburg than they would at the camp meeting. A few days after this, Brother Daniels came down to Oakland saying he must attend to his meetings up in Hillsburg. So you get the idea. The church felt like this was a great revival, and they, maybe shouldn't go to the camp meeting. They would stay there. So all of these ideas had made their way down to Oakland, and those in the conference, had a kind of a list of concerns already. And so when E.P. Daniels left to head down to the conference to let him know that he was kind of not planning on being there at the camp meeting, they were prepared to confront him with this list of grievances that seemed in their mind to be growing, quite large. And so it seems, reading through all the papers on this, that when E.P. Daniels got down there, they were prepared to really confront him on all of these things. And this is how C.H. Jones, again, the manager of the Pacific Press and on part of several of the conference committees, this is how he describes it. He says, after dinner, my wife, so E.P. Daniels came down and he invited him to eat with him and his wife. And this is what he says, after dinner, my wife and I had a little conversation with Daniels. And he summarized that conversation like this: he did talk more like an insane man than anything else. So, by the way, a lot of this correspondence was sent to W.C. White during this time, people from the conference, keeping W.C. White up to date of what was going on. It seems that before E.P. Daniels reached the office, he met with Elder Wagner and commenced the same tirade against our people to him. He also went on about the same to Dr. Wagner, that would be E.J. Wagner, the son of J.H. Wagner. Elder Wagner, Sr., took him to task for what he said to him, and at a meeting of consultation they had that night, Brother Daniels confessed that he had been led astray, and he was sorry for it. So you kind of get the idea. They confronted him. His response made him appear to C.H. Jones as more of an insane man. And obviously, J.H. Wagner really took him to task for his response as well. And Daniels confessed to his wrong. But that, of course, raised great concerns to J.H. Wagner, who was the sitting president for the sake of the Hillsburg Church. And A.T. Jones talks about what happened next. He says, there is no doubt that the Lord helped, and much good was done in Hillsburg. Then Satan stuck his cloven foot in and gave the work a wrong mold. The conference committee learned of it just at the time to go to the camp meeting, and they stopped the meetings. So as a result of this confrontation or communication with E.P. Daniels, they said, that's it. No more of these revival meetings. That this needs to stop. Not only that, the conference also felt that E.P. Daniels was not a safe man to be a pastor anymore in the state of California. And so Lizzie Granger writes, you will notice that in California conference proceedings, that no credentials were granted to him. And so usually every year they would have a camp meeting, and then they would have the conference meetings at the camp meeting. And they would go through business meetings and stuff like that. And they would also, give licenses for those that were able to speak in that conference and so forth. And that had happened at the California camp meeting during the conference meetings as well. Well, not only that, but the conference had also decided I'll just read this. You will also notice that the resolution in regard to Hillsburg College places the Bible teacher as the resident minister of Hillsburg Church. So the conference not only removed E.P. Daniels' license, they also said, well, let's make the Bible teacher be the pastor of the Hillsburg Church instead, and that will kind of put a stop to this fanaticism as they saw it. Brother A.T. Jones was appointed to the position of teacher in the college and in the Department of Biblical and Ancient History, and so that meant he would be right then immediately be put in as pastor of the Hillsburg Church. Dr. Wagner will succeed him in the 1st of January. So while Jones was teaching in the college, he would be the pastor of the Hillsburg Church until January, and then E.J. Wagner would take his place. Well, the conference, or some of the conference officials, J.H. Wagner and Loughborough, met with the church members from Hillsburg when they came down to the camp meeting. And based on that, need to go to Hillsburg and look into this situation even more. And so the executive committee of the California Conference went to Hillsburg. A.T. Jones not on the executive committee, but because he was pastor of the church, the new pastor of the church, took an active part in these meetings that took 3 days. The problem is that E.P. Daniels had gotten sick at the camp meeting, and he actually was at the sanitarium for a week when the executive committee was there. And so the executive committee met with the church, and they didn't really seem to get anywhere. In fact, it seemed to raise even more concerns in their mind, and this is how E.J. Wagner says it. He says, shortly after the camp meeting, we learned that quite a decided stand was being taken in Hillsburg against the conference committee, and that Brother Daniels was getting the sympathy of the church. He took the position of a martyr. And while he did not speak openly against the conference, he conveyed the impression that he was suffering wrongfully, but intended to bear it patiently. So the committee met there, and they couldn't really settle matters, but they did come away with the idea that now the church has, risen to defend their fired evangelist, and this is creating a problem. Well, there's one thing that followed soon after the executive committee came. The Sabbath School Association committee, some of the members were in Oakland, and happened to be that the vice president was W.C. Granger, who was one of the main proponents of not taking up the offering anymore during Sabbath school, because of what he saw, as a discrepancy of, how fundraising and just people were coming unprepared, and it just didn't seem like a Sabbath thing to do. And so the Sabbath School Association came there. The committee met in Hillsburg, and they had a talk with church members and W.C. Granger and other leaders, an opportunity to voice their concerns and so forth. And there was a few sermons preached on it. And some went through the biblical history of offerings, bringing offerings to the tabernacle and so forth. And others went through Adventist history to show that, this was something that had been talked about and gone over before. And thankfully, at the end of the Sabbath School Association, the executive committee's meetings, they came to an agreement. Here, this is what C.H. Jones says. He says, Brother Granger said, well, brethren, if this is the plan you're going to work on, I can clasp hands and work heartily with you. He said he never saw it in that light before, and I believe the battle is gained on that point, said C.H. Jones. And then notice what he said, C.H. Jones admits, but I do feel that there is a failing among our people not taking the interest in offerings as they should and trying to keep the right object in mind when they're giving. They're giving to the Lord, not to, the church per se. So this seemed to be a win, and through that, communication and so forth, the church then began to take up offerings again on Sabbath. However, C.H. Jones, after these meetings, went back to Oakland, and he had kind of the same concerns about the church in general. He said Brother Daniels had become puffed up. This is kind of how he summarized the whole event there at Hillsburg. He says, Brother Daniels had become puffed up over his success there, and he began to take the glory to himself. The Lord left him, and he began to backslide. He gave way to his feelings against the brethren and tried to get sympathy on his own behalf. He allowed the impression to go out that the conference committee and Elder Wagner especially were trying to crush him. And so people began to take sides at once, and the devil began to come in, and so the leaven has been working. So in other words, even though E.P. Daniels wasn't openly talking about this, somehow he was just, exuding this feeling, and the church was rising up against the conference because they said, well, you guys are trying to crush him. Well, A.T. Jones kind of repeats a similar thing. He says, then false reports began to fly. The church entered into judgment upon the committee, set it down that the committee, or Elder Wagner more specifically, as sitting president, was jealous of Brother Daniels and began to assume the championship of Brother Daniels against the committee. So this was definitely the feeling of the executive committee and Jones, who obviously was involved in some of these meetings. Now, another side or collateral damage in this whole thing was over the desire to build a new church. Interesting, notice this. First, I will say that during the revival meetings, large pledges had been made toward the church. But after the meetings were stopped, the church building business stopped. Brother Brownsberger called a meeting to plan for the church, but there was no response on the part of the congregation. So somehow during this revival, people's hearts had been touched, and they had pledged, they were ready to move forward with the building of this church. But when the conference closed down the meetings, fired the evangelist, there was no more desire to move forward with that. Well, finally, A.T. Jones and Professor Brownsberger, who were, he was a professor at the college, and he was very sympathetic to the conference and the conference committee. They decided to get together with the church and actually get together with E.P. Daniels and say, look, you've got to do something here at the Hillsburg church, or else, this is going to get out of hand. And I think they convinced E.P. Daniels that, if he needed to say something, there were some, radical things happening. There were a couple of church members. This wasn't the church in general, but there was one individual had written a letter to J.H. Wagner as the sitting president and basically told him, if you don't stop, coming down and crushing E.P. Daniels, I'm going to reveal to the rest of the conference all of your secret sins. Well, of course, that, didn't set real well. So, when E.P. Daniels realized this, well, this is how A.T. Jones talks about that. He says, well, this had gone on long enough, we thought, Professor Brownsberger and I determined to begin the task of bringing the matter to a stop. We laid the matter before Brother Daniels, and he took his stand on the right side, and in Sunday night's meeting, he publicly spoke against the harsh course toward the conference committee. So that felt like to Jones and Brownsberger that a step had been made. Well, interestingly enough, the next day, some of the more harsh members began running around. This is how Jones puts it. He says, then that threw a bomb into our camp. The next morning, they were running here and there, the few that had not been at this meeting, and there to the few who had not been present the night before, saying to them, Brother Daniels has gone back on us. Brother Daniels has gone back on us. So when E.P. Daniels did kind of take a stand and say, look, let's back off a bit here, then by some, they thought, well, now you've betrayed us. Well, This, by the way, this takes us up into November. The camp meeting was the revival meetings were August, September, then the camp meeting, and this takes us up into November. So there was a lot of this discussion and issues going, back and forth, executive committee coming, and then in November, towards the end of November, 1885, a lady by the name of Sister Baker, she had a little bit of a past where she had claimed to have visions and ideas on dress reform and so forth, but she took really a fanatical view on many things, and she was known for this. Well, she, in the latter part of November, she kind of, seeing what was going on at the Hillsburg church there, she wrote a 6-page document and submitted it to Brother Brownsberger and A.T. Jones. And in that, she basically claimed to have had a vision that the church needed to go forward and build a new church. And here was a whole list of things that needed to happen. One being that they should never use hammers. Only people that were converted could build, take part in building the building. E.P. Daniels was to be the bricklayer, according to her vision. I don't know that he was a mason, a bricklayer. There was a bunch of this kind of just really off-the-wall claims in her vision. But included in that was also these demands, I guess you could say, in her paper. She said Elders Wagner and Loughborough must come and confess to the church. Confession will open the gates and let the Spirit of the Lord in. So she basically added in there, that the conference needs to come and apologize for what they've done. And the revival meetings must go on as they were before the camp meeting. And when the church is built, it needs to be under exclusive control of the Hillsburg church so that no one can dictate what can be done there. Well, A.T. Jones and Brother Brownsberger saw this as just the proof in the pudding of this was all fanaticism all along. So they called the church together, and they read, A.T. Jones actually read this letter, I believe it was on a Sabbath, to the congregation. Then he asked them, is this not fanaticism, yes or no? And, what can you say when the document, has, some pretty off-the-wall ideas? Well, this is how he concludes. A.T. Jones, after that meeting, he says, we took that Baker letter with us, and I read it to the church, and then pointed out their wrong course in condemning the conference committee and entering into judgment upon the committee for their stopping the meeting. And if the meetings had been stopped just when they were, hadn't been stopped just when they were, the cause of God would have been disgraced before the world. So in other words, he was saying, thank God the committee got involved here, put a stop to these meetings before, it made us look bad before the world. He continues, and that instead of condemning the committee for stopping the meetings, they ought to be the most thankful people in the world. They nearly all gave testimonies and showed a disposition to take warning from their late experience and never speak evil or condemn what they don't understand. So Jones felt like that kind of solved the problems. The executive committee came back to Hillsburg right after this, and they had more meetings without E.P. Daniels there, and they felt like that helped settle the problem. Now, I know I've been talking for a little while, but what I've shared with you is the perspective of the conference committee and J.H. Wagner and the rest that were involved. All of these men, by the way, were good men that have done great things for the church before this time. But there happened to be another viewpoint that might fall into that category of the rest of the story. And in order for us to understand this story and our history, I think we have to look at all sides, because we as human beings can sometimes make mistakes in our perception. So now I want to go through kind of the same chronological order and share with you where the Hillsburg church saw this situation. So we'll start at the beginning. This is several different people writing letters about it. This is I.L. Decker. I must tell you about the good meetings. Elder Daniels has been laboring with this church for the last 4 weeks, and oh, such an awakening as this church has had. The Spirit of the Lord has been with him with might and power until everyone in the house felt the presence, until they could not resist it. Old, hardened sinners that have resisted all their lives have broken all to pieces. So they describe this revival as really genuine. People that had been, hardcore sinners. And boy, there's letter after letter naming particular people and the things that they overcame during this revival. Here's what Eunice Kelsey says. She says, the meetings did start in such heartfelt confessions as seemed to be made, such as I have never witnessed. The members coming together, asking forgiveness of each other with floods of penitential tears, and then rejoicing in assurance of pardon, which it did seem to me could be nothing else but the deep movings of the Spirit of God. In fact, one person even said, I think this is the beginning of the latter rain. G.I. Butler, who happened to visit, I'll talk about him later. He actually came to visit after this whole situation. This is how he described it. He says, I believe that Elder Daniels had got so near to God that God did greatly bless them. There are many manifest tokens of this, it seems to me. I've not heard of a work for years that seemed to bear more evidence of God's work than this does in many respects. The more I have investigated the subject, the stronger have been my convictions that this is the case. Now, you recognize already that these are diametrically different descriptions of even the man involved in this story, E.P. Daniels. Well, there was even baptisms. Hannah has gone with the children to the baptism. She thinks there were about 20 baptisms, most of them rebaptized. So there were baptisms. There was not only, church members, reconversion experiences, but there was a great interest even among outsiders. So there were people from the community that were coming to these revivals. There's a good interest among outsiders, says W.C. Granger. Quite a number of the new converts have been made. Among those who have united with the church are my wife's mother and cousin. And then E.P. Daniels himself, he says, when I closed the meetings by the order of the committee, there was a large outside interest, including, notice, Senator Condon was deeply interested in the meetings, and I was also informed that Mr. Jewett, obviously a member of the community, was interested in that he had been out a number of times to hear. So here's, eyewitness account saying this was a true revival going on. But what about, some of the fanaticism that was going on? Well, the issue over the offering, that seemed to have been solved. But there was, the issue of Daniel's debt. And even in this particular story, this is what Daniel himself said. Now I'm in good condition to pay off my debts. If I don't have any drawbacks, I do not want the brethren to pay off $1 of my debts. And more than that, I will not let them do so either. So somehow the communication, that made its way down to the conference had been misunderstood. He had made comments about his debt from the standpoint that he was telling people to get more involved in the work. And then he thought, well, what are they going to say when I'm working at a secular job, and not full-time in the ministry? And so he explained, well, I'm in debt. I came from Michigan in debt. And there was a couple that was not the church. It had nothing to do with a vote or anything publicly done. There was a couple of well-to-do church members that had given money to help pay off his debt so that he could go into the work full time. But it turns out, at least according to him, that he didn't even accept that money to pay off his debt. And it was probably used for some of the other evangelistic work. This is what G.I. Butler said, kind of summarizing the idea of fanaticism. He said, according to the best light I can get, there has been very little fanaticism connected with this church. Some of their moves were not the wisest, for they took extreme views on the subject of Sabbath donations and not preparing to come to the camp meeting, etc. But overall, G.I. Butler said, I don't think there was any big fanaticism that, has kind of been talked about. Well, what about the situation when E.P. Daniels went down to ask, to tell or ask that they keep the meetings going instead of coming to camp meeting. Well, this is how it's described from the church's perspective. It says, Brother Daniels informs me that Brother Wagner, sitting president, came down on him in a terrible manner and called the meetings a delusion and the deepest kind of fanaticism, and that he was not fit to go out without some good substantial man with him. I learned that Brother Loughborough is following in the same track. So E.P. Daniels' recollection of the story is slightly different than that told by C.H. Jones and others there. What about the heated exchange? Well, Lockwood continues, when Brother Wagner opposed Brother Daniels caught some of his spirit and spoke hastily, and Wagner took the advantage of it and came down, I should gauge, in an unchristian manner. Brother Daniels asked him to forgive and not to have the matter go further, but no, he rebuked him and made him feel the lash so much more. So this clash that had happened between E.P. Daniels, the evangelist, and the sitting conference president had obviously, tempers had raised, and E.P. Daniels obviously had recognized that and apologized, but no, according to Lockwood, this then was taken advantage of. Well, what about the meetings with the Hillsburg church that the committee had there at the camp meeting? This is what Mrs. Granger says. The Hillsburg company was called together at the camp meeting, and Elder Loughborough and J.H. Wagner impressed upon their minds, that if he, Wagner, was at liberty to tell what he knew about E.P. Daniels, they would be well satisfied that he was not fit for the ministry. And he told them that the work at Hillsburg was fanaticism. Most of the company stood firm, however, in favor of the work here. And Elder Daniels would have been thankful, so says his wife, to have made a plain statement in regard to the talk he had with Elder Wagner. In other words, the committee got together with the Hillsburg church members, but E.P. Daniels was not there to give any response or to say, yeah, I did get upset, but I apologize, and I recognize he was not there. His wife said he would have been glad to be there, but he was not invited. Well, Daniel should not labor in California. Since the camp meeting, Elder Wagner and his son EJ and also Loughborough visited Hillsburg. It's talking about the executive committee coming to Hillsburg. Elder Wagner made the remark that Elder Daniels was not a person who should labor in the conference. So right off, from the church's perspective, the committee had come up and basically told him, we're in charge. This guy's not fit to be an evangelist or, a part-time pastor here at your church. This is how G.I. Butler describes it. He says, the revulsion of the feelings occasioned by the course of the conference committee in stopping the meetings, and notice how he applies it, which, by the way, was Brother Wagner's act especially, it seems to me, and at the effort they made to prove that all the work was very nearly fanatical, these things all together produce feelings of decided unpleasantness in the hearts of some who had taken quite a prominent part in the work. So in other words, this seemed to be J.H. Wagner's personal issue with E.P. Daniels. That's how G.I. Butler saw it. Well, what happened with the great interest by with outsiders? Lizzie Granger says, I wrote you about our excellent meetings. They were stopped suddenly, branded as fanaticism, while outsiders were never so stirred, house crowded with eager, hungry souls. The outside interest is so great that people kept asking, this is people from the community, when will that preacher begin his lectures? We want to hear him. He promised to give a course of lectures. That's how the Hillsburg church saw the situation, that a great interest was stirred. Well, what about Jones, reading this Baker letter and basically saying this represents this whole movement in Hillsburg? Again, W.C. Granger says the worst feature about the experience was its being made publicly at a meeting in which there were a number of outsiders. Elder Jones tried hard to make it appear that Baker's writings were a true index to the character of the meetings we had had and were the natural outgrowth of Brother Daniel's preaching. Well, in regard to the executive committee coming up the second time, end of November, this is how the Hillsburg Church saw it. They said 2 or 3 days after the experience of Sister Baker, Elder Loughborough Ing and E.J. Wagner came up and called the church together and had an investigation into the character of the meetings. Meetings were held 3 evenings. Before the first meeting, Brother Ings expressed to me his opinion that the meetings that they had in Hillsburg had been fanaticism. Elders Loughborough and J.H. Wagner also had considerable to say about fanaticism. So this was pretty much the idea of the conference committee, that this whole church had been wrapped up in fanaticism. And they had rightfully, put a stop to it. Well, W.C. Granger also expresses concern about the influence this had on the interest from the outside. He says the meetings with the conference committee were also held publicly. A number of outsiders were present each evening. The great burden of the elders was to show that the revival meetings were fanatical and that Elder Daniel's preaching was the cause of it. I think it was a great mistake to have the investigative meetings with outsiders present. I've been told that downtown a great deal of jesting and laughing were indulged in by the street loafers at our expense. Wow. By the way, I had to take out so many slides to fit this into a time frame. And there's a lot of them I wish I would have left in. One of them was that the Methodists and the Episcopalians started revival meetings right after the Hillsburg meetings closed and brought in one, I think it was the Methodists, 45 members into their church. So it's 1885. Seventh-day Adventists are supposed to be taking a gospel message to the world. They've been preaching for 40 years that there's coming a time when Revelation 13, that beast with lamb-like horns is going to speak as a dragon. Not that it just applies to Sunday laws, it applies to much more. And it wasn't just that Sunday laws were coming, they were enacted and being enforced. 1885. And now you have, in the fastest growing, largest church in California, a controversy between the leaders and the church members. Jesus talked about unity and the power of unity, and there was anything but that in Northern California. So what do you do? How do you solve this when you have 2 storylines? It's like you're hearing 2 different stories. They don't even hardly match up. Thank you. Well, interestingly, E.J. Wagner had this to say. He said, I wish to say further that many of the people there in Hillsburg, and also Brother Daniels, have been holding out because they thought they would have your mother's sanction. He's writing to W.C. White. They knew that Brother Daniels had been working for your mother and that she had told him he ought to be in the work. And therefore they jumped to the conclusion that she would endorse whatever he might do. Thank you, brother. So you get the point. E.J. Wagner saying, Hillsburg Church kind of holding out that Ellen White's going to come to their defense. Aurora Lockwood, she was the sister of G.I. Butler, and she wrote to Ellen White. This is what she said. There was 3 long evening meetings here, first of the week, attended by 6 ministers from the conference, leaving out Brother Daniels, and our hearts were sad. If the Lord ever sees, it will be for his glory or our good, for you, Ellen White, to understand it, then you will know what has been right and what has been wrong. You can kind of hear that anguished cry from a Hillsburg church member. And I wonder if 140 years later, we ought to be asking the same question. If the Lord ever sees fit, sees it will be for his glory and our good, for you to understand it, then you will know what has been right and what has been wrong. Well, again, I've showed 2 sides of the story, and I realize I'm almost gone an hour, 55 minutes. But if I stop now, you will not know the rest of the story. So I suggest we keep going. Is that okay? Okay. Now the question is, what could Ellen White do? She's in Europe at the time. She'll be there for another 1.5 years. She's received letters from both church members and conference members. But they're divided by a long space. What can she possibly say to fix the problem? Well, it turns out that Ellen White would weigh in, and maybe I should say more appropriately, heaven weighed in. I have been much burdened, she says, over matters in Hillsburg. I've had many solemn dreams, and have been in their midst and heard things spoken and seen the Spirit manifested. And then the result has been shown me. Apparently, when God is involved, you don't have to be in Hillsburg to know what's going on in Hillsburg. You know what's going on even in the king's bedchamber, right? I mean, in his private chambers. Because God can reveal it. So I'm going to close my meeting by reading heaven's response. And I realize this will take us a few minutes more, but hold on. I'm going to go through it the same way, chronologically. This is taken from about 6 different letters, primarily written to conference leaders, some to the Hillsburg Church. And by the way, I would add, she did have correction for E.P. Daniels in some things. But let's go through what she had to say. The work done in Hillsburg, I do not doubt, was of God. And I was grateful to have the Lord work by whom he will. I have no envy, no jealousy that this result did not follow my earnest, wearing labors for that church. Here's a true sign of somebody that surrendered their case with God. Ellen White spent, several months working with the church and nothing seemed to happen. And then God sends somebody else it would seem she's indicating, and she's not jealous over the results. Many letters, talking about the confession, she said, many letters of confession have come to me from different ones. All really express in their letters genuine repentance for sins. Many of the church members, the conviction they had at this revival was that, they'd been balking against the spirit of prophecy. Some students confessed the fact that they hated one of the professors because he was always reading from the testimonies. Brethren, it's high time that revival similar to the one that was stirred the church at Hillsburg should come to every Seventh-day Adventist church in our land. Else, the church will not be prepared to receive the latter rain. Well, what about the fanaticism part, though, right? This is what she said about that. And by the way, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have to read the letters, the entire letters. I believe the work at Hillsburg to be genuine. I believe there was deep movings of the Spirit of God. I believe unconsecrated, unconverted ones urge themselves to the front. The enemy always works through those of unbalanced minds and imperfect characters. I do not believe that Elder Daniels moved wisely in all things, but has not God presented before you the defects and want of wisdom in your ways and in your management? She's writing W.C. White to pass on to the committee members. In other words, was there some issues that took place here that, weren't the best? Yes. But what about your defects? What about what she say about the meeting stopped? In regard to Elder Daniels, he is finite. He is not infallible. But there is such a disposition to judge others, they do not keep in view that God works by whom he will. Christ is to be seen as officiating through the delegated servant. The great evil is that the mind becomes narrowed and loses sight of the chief worker. It gets on the instrument and decides the people cannot be advantaged unless the manners and habits of the worker meet their own pattern exactly. You have to do it exactly like I say, or it can't be done. If Elder Daniels erred in some things, who of you, writing to the conference committee, who of you dare to tell him to preach no more? Who of you dared to stop the work because in your finite judgment, everything did not appear to meet your ideas? Every time I think of this matter, I am so pained, I try to put it out of my mind at once. This is what she said about the private meeting they had with the Hillsburg members there at the camp meeting. I learned, she says, that Elder Daniels has been forbidden to preach, about his credentials, that his credentials have not been renewed. Did God give you light from heaven, directing you to take this course? Or prompted by a feeling that Elder Daniels had injured you? She's writing specifically to J.H. Wagner, the sitting conference president. Did you move in your own spirit? I do not like this kind of work. What right had you or any one of you to pursue the course you have toward Elder Daniels? What about the work with the outsiders? You had no moral right to stop the meetings, stop Elder Daniels from going right forward with the work and making the very most of the interest started, to gather outsiders into the interest if possible. I cannot sanction your course. I cannot see that while you were working to correct evils, as you might have done, that you should stop the work. Writing to the entire committee, she says, now Elder J.H. Wagner's prejudice came in, causing him to pass his judgment on the work, and others followed in its wake. I verily believe you had but little of the Spirit of God in your camp meeting, for I cannot see how God could work with your efforts. Here's what she again says about this abuse of authority. When you venture to exercise your power in the way you have done toward E.P. Daniels, I have to tell you freely, I have no confidence in it. Take your iron heel off the man. When you get upon the track of one whom you think has not treated you as he should, you bear down heavier and heavier with crushing power. The very words that the committee had used to say, this is the fanaticism of this church. They're complaining about us coming down with crushing power. And Ellen White uses the same term to describe what they were doing. Should God deal with you according to the magnitude of the offenses of you have dealt with Elder Daniels, there would be no hope for your future. Well, what about the meeting, the private meeting they had there at the camp meeting with E.P. Daniels, or the members without E.P. Daniels? I hear you took the Hillsburg people in a tent and stated that if you were at liberty to relate some of the things which you knew concerning Elder Daniels, they would regard the work as you did. And thus you left a blot on one of God's servants, leaving them to think and imagine the worst things in his life. Is this the way God has dealt with you? Do you wish the Lord to take your case in hand and deal with you as you have dealt with Elder Daniels? Your course in this I cannot approve. Well, what about the executive committee coming to Hillsburg? I have reason to judge a good work was begun in Hillsburg. Those who felt it was wrong and condemned it committed, I believe, one of the greatest errors. And now the condemnation has been made. It will be as in similar cases. After once the work of a brother or the manifestations in the church are condemned, then there is a seizing hold of very little things to make good the decision that they made hastily in an unwise manner. You get the idea, right? Very clearly what had happened. Not only did the executive committee follow the lead of J.H. Wagner, but now they needed to make that decision good. So the list of grievances kept growing. Notice again what she says. Have you not been so zealous to make it appear that Elder Daniel's course was wrong, that all the fanatical movements had been, in your judgment, the fruit of his labors? Now, I do not believe this. I believe that a good work was begun in Hillsburg, and the stopping of Elder Daniels from preaching was occasioned by the position of Elder Wagner that Elder Wagner took on his case. So Ellen White supported that view that the Hillsburg church members felt about the situation. She continues, then after the first step had been taken, there must be an effort made to maintain that the course pursued toward him was right. I do not and cannot believe it. I believe the very beginnings was wrong, and that Elder Wagner or any other elder had no delegated right from God to stop the meetings in Hillsburg, and that evils have grown out of this. This spirit to denounce and condemn so readily, as if it were a small matter to tear a man up by the roots, has been manifested many times. It is a work that savors of Satan wherever it is seen. And as a people who are seeking to save souls rather than to blast and destroy, we need to mix into our manners and ways of dealing with men and women more of the compassion and love of Jesus and less of self. And then she continues, I have seen the harm done by our brethren seeing something wrong in a man and then questioning or picking him to pieces and leaving no good thing in him, but just discarding him as a useless piece of timber, that I'm most thoroughly distressed over this kind of management. Well, what did she say about the second executive committee meeting that were held there in Hillsburg before outsiders? Were there not matters made public before unbelievers that opened before him the defects of the church? Oh, how carefully should this matter have been handled. She talks about the negative effects on the whole church. I find myself pondering the Hillsburg church and its revival and the condemnation of it with a sadness I cannot express by pen or voice. It was not one man's case alone to be dealt with, but a large and important church was involved, whose whole after experience would bear the marks of the present management. I know what I'm talking about. Your management alarms me. I have no confidence in this kind of work you have been engaged in. You have placed matters in a miserable shape. Confusion has come into the church. A different course might have been taken by our brethren and saved all this bad result and reaction. She talks about disunity, by the way, too. And I don't want to, again, part of the problem with trying to cram every detail is, missing some of the points. She did write to E.P. Daniels, told him they should have planned right off to go to the camp meeting and share the revival there. She did caution him on, a few other points. She did write to the Hillsburg church members and encourage them, for unity. But notice where she puts primarily the blame. She says, there is much said about Elder E.P. Daniels as though there are two different parties. One, Elder Daniels' friends, and still another party who are distinct from him. Okay, now follow the thought as she defines this. I beg of you not to breathe one word of this character. There are those in the Hillsburg church who cannot see in Elder Daniels the cause of the course that has been pursued toward him by the conference brother. And that leads those conference brethren who have not been wise and judicious in their feelings and course of action to feel that their course was not sustained and to draw themselves apart from Elder Daniels, and they will thus show their distrust and criticism and speak it and act it, and this will make two parties if nothing else will. If there is a division in the Hillsburg church, I shall attribute it not to Elder Daniels alone, but to those who have had the management of these matters. If my brethren, if you act and talk all the time as though there were not union, you will shape matters so that there will not be union. You can establish yourself in the conference of the Hillsburg church if you will move wisely, discreetly, but not by trying to magnify Elder Daniel's wrongs and seeking to fasten blame upon him. Say nothing about Elder Daniel's popularity. Say nothing about the danger of disaffection in the church. Well, I'm going to end with these couple slides. I find this really significant. She's writing to basically the executive committee. And this is how she actually started the letter. And it ought to make us pause. I wish to say some things in reference to the revival at Hillsburg. I wish to say I'm not in harmony with your treatment of this matter. That there were fanatical ones who pressed into the work, I would not deny. But if you move in the future, as you have done in this matter, you may be assured of one thing. And I think it would be good for us to know what that one thing is, because it's relevant to us. If you move in the future, as you have done in this matter, you will be assured of one thing. You'll condemn the work of the latter rain when it shall come. Why? For you will see at that time far greater evidences of fanaticism. Why? Because the devil knows if he can bring in a little bit of fanaticism and have individuals or churches or conferences throw out the baby with the bathwater, then the latter rain is pushed away. And if ever we should understand our history, it's on this point, because 3 years after this, according to Ellen White herself, the Lord did pour out the beginning of the latter rain at a general conference session in Minneapolis. And this is how she summarized the sad event in 1896. I shall never, I think, she says, be called to stand under the direction of the Holy Spirit as I stood at Minneapolis. All assembled in that meeting had an opportunity to place themselves on the side of truth by receiving the Holy Spirit, which was sent by God in such a rich current of love and mercy, but in the rooms occupied by some of our people was heard ridicule, criticism, jeering, and laughter. The manifestations of the Holy Spirit were attributed to fanaticism. That's part of our history, and this did happen. Now, we're told that we have nothing to fear for the future unless we forget. So what about us today? What lessons can we learn from our past that would prevent us from making similar mistakes today? Now, thinking about this talk, I didn't really come here to step on, a few individuals' toes. But my prayer is that the Holy Spirit, who knocks on the door, Jesus himself, the true witness, knocking on all of the doors of our heart, would be stepping on all of our toes. The devil knows that each of us can fall for different things. He has some temptations for some people, and he has some temptations for others. And while we are praying that God will save this church, let's not forget that our biggest number one enemy is self. That person that looks back to us in the mirror every morning when we're brushing our teeth. I can't change everything that goes on in my church. But I can pray that the Holy Spirit can change this hard heart of mine, so I don't have any of those evil principles working out in my own life. And if we get to that point where Daniel was, we should still be praying the prayer of Daniel 9. Lord, we have sinned and done all this evil. Save us, we pray. May that be our prayer.
Now, there's just a little bit more to this message The next 13 minutes from another message will give you the follow-up to this story. I encourage you to watch it.
Now, as I start, I'm going to talk about this Sunday laws are coming, but are we ready, right? But we're ready, right? But before I do that, I need to finish the rest of the story that I shared last night, because I think there's a few points I did want to bring out, and I could in no way pack it all into 1 hour or a little over an hour. So I want to finish with a few other thoughts, and that is what happened after Ellen White's letters arrived in Hillsburg. And this is interesting to me because she sent the letters, and then G.I. Butler happened to be coming out to the west, and she asked him specifically to go to check in on Hillsburg and to see what was going on and to do what he could to help things out there. And so this is what he says. He says, there was quite a feeling that Brother Loughborough and some others, probably from the committee, had not really admitted their mistake in trying to prove that the work was all fanatical, etc. And he's talking about that revival meeting, fall of 1885. As much as they really ought to, for after your letters came, Ellen White, and the thing was begun to turn the other way, and the work was acknowledged to be of God, they claimed to have felt so all the time. So even after Ellen White's letters came, not everybody, but some obviously of the brethren had said, oh yeah, we knew it wasn't all fanaticism, we believe it was a true revival. And so some felt that there should have been a good confession made from some of these brethren. So some, I do believe, really did confess, and I'll explain why in a moment, but others, it appears, including Elder Loughborough, didn't really come out openly and say, hey, we made a mistake. Well, Butler actually did a week of prayer, and he kind of got the impression as he was going along that there was, there just was something holding the people back. And so he had a bunch of the, people come to Elder Daniels' home, E.P. Daniels, and about 35 of the members, and they met together there, and they continued on until 9 o'clock that night, so for several hours. They went on to give free expressions to the feelings as to how they felt in reference to the way they had been treated, how near God came to them, and then to have it treated in the way it was more than they could well bear. And some of them did not see how they could keep feelings of resentment out of their heart. So you can sympathize with this, what they were feeling. It's like we went through this terrible experience and there didn't seem to be closure. We don't want to be resentful. We don't want to be, have animosity toward our brethren, but we don't know how to keep it out of our heart. Well, I think the Lord impressed G.I. Butler. He sympathized. He really did, like a father. But he also helped them move beyond this. And this is interesting. He said, on Sabbath, I preached on my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect through weakness. The Lord gave me freedom. In the afternoon, we had a social meeting, and the college hall was crowded. We gave an opportunity for those to come forward who wished to draw nearer to God, and there was a general move, and the whole house nearly came forward. The Lord came very near, and some good testimonies were born. Now, of course, I'm just, giving you a summary, but Butler preached on the fact that, God is big enough to take your hurts and wounds, even inflicted by your own brethren, and to carry you forward. And this seemed to have an effect on the people. And it brought, again, a revival. And I think they were able to let go of some of that bitterness that they felt. Well, Butler was getting ready to go back to Oakland. In fact, he says, I expected to go to Oakland this morning, but some talk was had relative to their church building. And you'll remember what happened. Ellen White had tried to get him, look, your church is growing, you need to build a new church. She could never get the members to come forward to put enough money out to really see the vision of building a church and a big attachment so they could do classes and outreach with that. And then E.P. Daniels came and did that 5-week series, revival meetings. Never started with that intent, but it motivated the church and they were ready to move forward. And then when the conference came in and shut down the whole program, fired the evangelist, that was the stop of the whole thing. But now, after Butler had visited early 1886, he says, I expressed my mind that it was time, something was done on it, and we had a short meeting of the trustees last night, and they urged me to stay over till tonight and to talk to the whole church on the subject. So that's what they did. They got the whole church together, and we had a meeting of the church at Hillsburg that night before I left. There was quite a good attendance. After talking a little while on it, I asked an expression of the house relative to what they wanted to do about it. The expression was strongly in favor of going right ahead with it. Nearly 3,000 was subscribed, I think that's dollars, that night, which brings the whole amount pledged and raised to about $10,000. And so that congregation got together based on what God had done in their heart, even after this whole experience. And they built that church in Hillsburg. This is not a drawing, this is a picture of the church. It was dedicated in the early summer of '87. And I don't have a picture of it from the back, but it also had that large addition with classrooms and space for doing outreach, which they had wanted to do and anticipated. But what about, some of the players, these men that were on that committee, which I talked about? Some I truly believed saw their mistake. Others were more reluctant to admit that. J.H. Wagner, who had kind of led the charge more because of a personal issue he had with E.P. Daniels, was perhaps the most reluctant. Remember, I read yesterday some of the statements Ellen White said, if you treat others like this, is that the way you want God to treat you? And in some of those statements, she even infers, if you deal with others this way, you will be dealt with in the same way. And interestingly enough, 6 months after this event, and almost at the same time that Butler came, a little bit after that, Ellen White had to write to J.H. Wagner and address him on some of his own personal issues, including the fact, and I don't want to overstate this, but that he was getting a little too friendly with one of the ladies in the church at Oakland who was not his wife. And he didn't listen to her advice, and so she sent, almost a year later, 87, a letter to J.H. Wagner, but she sent it through Butler and S.N. Haskell, so they could go labor with J.H. Wagner and say, you are in a very important position and this needs to stop. Well, interestingly enough, they came down on him so hard, they about crushed him. And there's several points that I gather from this. This is Ellen White writing to Butler after that. She says, I cannot feel that your course toward Elder Wagner is altogether right. I think you have shut off the man where he has no chance of his life. When men themselves, liable to temptation, erring mortals shall be free to pronounce upon another's case who is humbled in the dust, just how much feeling the erring one should manifest to be pardoned, they are taking on themselves that which God has not required of them. So this is what happened. Here's Butler, this is so amazing to me. He had sympathized with the church. He did the right thing, led them to actually move forward and build their building project. And then when he's in that position himself, he came down with the same crushing force on somebody else. Which tells me that human nature is human nature, regardless of which one of us, that we can notice the abuse of authority other places, and we should, but we can do the same things ourselves. So we need to pray always, Lord, save us from this situation, but save us from repeating that. The other thing is that sometimes God allows sin to punish sin. This is obviously wasn't his intent with J.H. Wagner, but he was fired. He was no longer editor of the Signs or the American Sentinel. He had been planned to be sent to Europe. They canceled that. I haven't found out yet, but I don't know if they even canceled his, speaking credentials. But at any rate, J.H. Wagner was at this time humbled in the dust. He did end up going to Europe, and I believe the Lord blessed him. It got him out of the situation, and he finished his life in a very positive way there. What about Loughborough? Interesting, this is another interesting note. When the church got together just a few days after G.I. Butler preached to them, and they decided to go forward and build the church, even though at the beginning of the week they had said, we're frustrated that, Loughborough, they even named him. He doesn't seem to have come out and really apologized. They actually, when they decided to build the church, they elected him as the head of the building committee, which tells me they were willing to still move on and seek for unity. Well, a couple of years later, he actually became California Conference president. That didn't go real well. And in 1890, Ellen White said he needs to be relieved of that labor so he can do what God really has given him to do. And this is what she says: let Elder Loughborough do a work that is suffering to be done in the churches. The Lord would have his voice heard, as was John's, telling the things which he himself has experienced in the rise and progress of the third angel's message. Let Elder Loughborough stand in his right place as a Caleb coming to the front and bearing a decided testimony. The whole point of that is Loughborough made a terrible mistake, but God still had work for him to do. And he actually started going to camp meetings, sharing the history of Adventism, along with the message of righteousness by faith that Jones and Wagner were preaching, and religious liberty. And there were revivals that went across the land, 1890s into the 1895 time period. What about Jones and Wagner? They were both involved. I truly believe that they acknowledged this based on the fact that another letter written in 87 to them by Ellen White, they immediately apologized. Really, they humbled their hearts and said, yes, we were wrong. And I also believe that there's not every letter is available today that's mentioned. So there's some letters that Ellen White sent and some that she received that are mentioned, but I haven't found copies of those yet. So that may still come. But also the fact that Hillsburg church members spoke so highly of A.T. Jones after that incident. They were frustrated, that he followed along on the executive committee. But I believe that there was truly a confession in Jones and Wagner's life because they were so highly spoken of after that on the West Coast. Well, as we know, 3 years later, they ended up going to Minneapolis and being identified as special messengers with a message from heaven. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. But I kind of wanted to finish that story from yesterday, just kind of, finish it off with the idea that, God knows everything that is going on in this church, and he can fix it. The important thing is, let's make sure we're doing whatever the Lord is asking us to do. If it's speaking out, let's speak out, but let's do it in the right spirit so that we're not guilty of the very things we're frustrated that other people have done to us. Well, Sunday laws are coming, but we're ready, right? Well, interestingly, Thursday afternoon, I talked about how there was moral decline in this country. 1844 was the beginning, really, of that, when the churches rejected the first angel's message, and that's kept the country spiraling. And it began to go deeper and deeper into apostasy. The churches obviously had a part in that. And communism, socialism, Uriah Smith mentioned that in his book, were coming in. There was a woke movement in that day. Liberties were being trampled on the left. And in 1863, the NRA rose up and said, we've got to fix this terrible problem. And they decided the best way to do that is to go to Caesar instead of back to their churches and saying, we need God to come in a big way and fix the problem in our own churches. They went to Caesar, exactly what Dr. O was just describing. And so they started by trying to do a national Sunday law. They did that for 16 years. It never went anywhere. And then they said, let's go state by state. 1879, that's when they started going state by state. Within only a few years, every one of the 38 plus states, almost everyone, there was one that didn't, and the territories had enforced Sunday laws, not just talking about them, but laws that were in force and in place then. So are we heading that way again? But in 1888, they were already being enacted. And now Senator Blair, who grabbed a hold of this movement, said, now we need a national one. And notice this, his bill, May 21, for a national Sunday law, he says, the national law is needed to make the state laws complete and effective. So if you want to know where these state laws that Dr. O just talked about, it'll start at the state. It won't take very long because they're already there. And then it will be a national one right out, soon after. That's what happened in 1888.
Friends, I encourage you to share this message, to think about it, and to realize our humanity is no different or better now than it was 140 years ago. Let's pray for our leaders. Let's be bold and courageous, kind and noble. And may we not repeat the history. We do not have to be doomed or condemned to repeating history. We can do better, but it's going to require brave hearts, brave men, brave women, and brave young people to say, we must do better than we've done before. God bless you as you pray and consider what God might be asking you to do after watching this message.